Okay, let's get the Canadian perspective on this. Marco Mendicino is the Minister of Public Safety. Minister, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So we know of a Chinese spy balloon and now 3 other mystery aerial objects all shut down. To the best of your knowledge, what is going on here?
Well, those are the fundamental questions which we are posing right now, and I would begin by saying that recovery operations are being conducted in real time as we speak. We have deployed the Canadian Armed Forces, the RCMP, and the Coast Guard to locate themselves within the remote stretches of land and water where we believe we will be able to recover some of the debris of the objects which have been taken down. Once they have conducted those operations, we will begin to dig into the very basic questions that you have posed and which I'm sure Canadians will want to know answers to. But in the meantime, I want to assure your viewers and all Canadians that we are using every tool in our arsenal, including most recently the deployment of NORAD jets this past weekend to protect Canadian and North American airspace and to protect our national sovereignty.
It seems pretty clear the first one was Chinese in origin, right? I mean, they've just said it was a weather balloon, but we know it's something that came from China. These 3 mystery objects, do you believe state actors are behind these?
Well, in the first instance, we will never shy away from condemning any hostile state activities as we have done in the past, whether it's PRC or anyone else for that matter. But as to exactly what the origins of these objects were, we are going to examine that question very carefully, which is why we've got CAF and RCMP and Coast Guard to take a look at these objects to determine where they may have originated, to give us their best advice and intelligence analysis on what capabilities they may have posed. But we're deploying all of those tools and measures to ensure that we protect Canadian airspace and sovereignty.
Right, but the Prime Minister said today that there's a pattern emerging here with these objects. Is that pattern China? Is that what's happening here? Is it the People's Republic that is sending all of these over?
I think he's right to foreshadow that there may very well be, as we conduct the recovery operations and look more closely at any physical evidence and take the analysis that is necessary, we'll be able to sharpen the extent of that answer. But in the meantime, we'll know, your Canadians should know, that we'll deploy NORAD and Canadian forces and law enforcement and public safety agencies as we need to protect our national security and sovereignty.
But just to circle back, do you believe, whether it's China or not, do you believe this was a state actor? I mean, could this be some scientific balloon? Could this be an amateur balloon? Or do you think this is something that takes the resources and efforts of a government somewhere to settle off?
I understand why you're pressing on the question. I would discourage any speculation. I think it's really important to allow all of the agencies that are on the ground to do their job. They need to be able to do it thoughtfully and methodically. The exercise of doing a forensic analysis and understanding exactly what kind of patterns may be emerging, as the Prime Minister said, is going to be an important part of that exercise. What the origins were, whether or not this is a state or a non-state actor, those are all questions which we want to make sure that we get right before we share those details with Canadians.
But have you asked the question directly? Because I know journalists asked the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson if these 3 mystery objects were Chinese. The answer was, I do not have anything on that. Has Canada formally asked China if this was them?
Look, I think what you need to know and what Canadians need to know is that whenever it comes to condemning the activities of a hostile actor, that we never shy away from doing that. And that is true of foreign interference. That is true of any violations of our airspace, as these objects clearly were, in fact, in violation of. And we need to do the work now to make sure that we understand exactly what these objects were. Here's what we know. 1, they're obviously airborne. 2, they carried no payload. But 3, they were violating our airspace. And that's why we acted swiftly and decisively and seamlessly with our American partners through NORAD, and we'll continue to deploy every tool in our arsenal to protect our sovereignty.
So, but does the hunt for answers include formally asking China, or are you going to wait till you actually have the debris and you can look at it and see what it is before drawing conclusions? Where are we?
We won't shy away from condemning. We'll obviously engage diplomatically where appropriate through my colleague, Minister Joly. And in the meantime, what's important is that we carry out these recovery operations and that we continue to take swift and decisive action when it comes to protecting our airspace, our North American perimeter.
Okay, so shooting it down when we see them and tweaking the radar specs, as Mr. Kirby said at the White House today to find these things. I understand all of that and condemning it, but this is a violation of Canadian sovereignty, is it not, for a foreign power to send something without approval into Canadian airspace? So if we know one was state responsible to some degree, if we find out that these are state actors, what's Canada's response here?
Well, I think there are a number of important points in your question. I mean, in the first instance, yes, I can confirm that these were not authorized to be in Canadian or North American airspace. That's the reason why we deployed quickly and took swift and decisive action to protect our sovereignty in the air. Number two, you pointed out, I think quite rightly, that there may very well be an evolution in the threats to our national security landscape, whether it's by air, by land, by sea, or digitally for that matter, which is why we continue to invest right across our national security apparatus, which is why we continue to invest in NORAD. $40 billion to enhance Canadian capabilities in a binational force that has protected North American sovereignty for the last 60 years since the Cold War. I think this past weekend is a shining example of how that cooperation and how that seamless coordination is working to protect Canadian and American interests, and it will continue to going forward.
You've seen the criticism, though, that it was American jets that took the shot, that took these objects out of the sky, that in all the cases, I know it's been a joint command and a joint response, but it was the Americans that took it down. So how do you respond to the fact, the criticism from the Conservatives in particular, that Canada just isn't pulling its weight militarily when it comes to these things?
I've seen it. I would discourage Monday morning quarterbacking the day after the Super Bowl. I think it is important, on the other hand, for Canadians to know that the Prime Minister ordered, after a call with the President of the United States, that the object be taken down. Once NORAD is deployed, those are binational forces, and it is through the collaborative efforts of both of our countries that we were able to protect Canadian airspace, and we will continue to use that effort going forward.
We heard from John Kirby, the U.S. National Security Council spokesperson today. For one, he reassured us it's probably not aliens, so we can put that away. But he did say these objects passed over sensitive sites, and there is some concern of what information they maybe could have gathered by doing that. We've heard from other experts that maybe this is an attempt to test the responsiveness and the readiness of NORAD by infiltrating airspace with a non-aggressive asset, in a way, to see where our vulnerabilities might be. What do you think these devices are being used for? What information do you have as to what the purpose and intention of these things are?
I want to make sure, and I think the government needs to be sure, that we get the best possible analysis and intelligence on all of that before we answer the question. In the meantime, what is important for Canadians to know is that in the face of these threats, that we will never hesitate to take the actions that are necessary through the deployment of NORAD, through the deployment of our Canadian Armed Forces, through the deployment of the RCMP, through the deployment of the Coast Guard, to protect all modes and to protect our sovereignty. And again, using every tool in our arsenal, staying in contact with our American allies, staying in contact with our provincial and territorial partners. This past weekend, I had a chance to reach out directly to Premier Pillai from Yukon, along with my colleague, Minister Van Dal. I think it's important that we provide that information to impacted areas, staying in touch with Indigenous communities and First Nations communities that have been impacted as well, is all part of the whole of government approach that we are taking to make sure that we protect our sovereignty.
Right, and Premier Pillai is going to be on the show a little bit later to speak to us about this, but I guess when can we know more? I appreciate there's a recovery operation happening in the rugged terrain of Yukon and in the deep waters of Lake Huron, but what's your sense of how quickly Canadians can get an answer to what exactly is floating through our skies up there?
It's a fair question. I'm a little reticent to give you precise timelines because, for example, in the recovery effort that is being conducted in Yukon, it's in a location between Mayo and Dawson, which is a really remote stretch of land, not easily accessible, even dangerous at this time of year. So we do have to allow the time for the agencies that are on the ground to do their work. In Lake Huron, we don't know exactly precisely yet where the object is, but those efforts are afoot. If it's an underwater operation, it's going to be difficult at this time of year, given we're in the middle of winter. And so we do have to allow for the space and time for the experts in the field to do their work. But as soon as we can share more details, we will. And in the meantime, we'll deploy all of the tools in our arsenal to protect airspace and our sovereignty.
Okay, Minister Mendicino, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.